Night shift nurses from community college programs are why this hospital is failing accreditation. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before his entire world collapsed. Sarah Chen moves through Seattle General in Philadelphia like a ghost. Fluorescent lights cast shadows across her impassive face. Antiseptic smell mixing with floor wax. The rhythmic beep of monitors her only conversation. Her hands are steady. Precise. Clinical. No tremor. No hesitation. She adjusts an 4-line on the 3rd floor, the needle slides in with the kind of fluid grace that comes from doing something 10,000 times, and the elderly patient barely flinches. "You're good at that," the woman whispers. Sarah doesn't answer. Just checks the drip rate and moves to the next room like wind moving through a corridor, present but intangible. In her locker in the break room, tucked behind folded scrubs still damp from last night's washing, sits a pair of worn combat boots. Men's size 10. Far too large for her small frame. The leather is cracked and stained with something that looks like dried mud but isn't. She reaches for them at the start of every shift. Her fingers trace the worn heel. The scuffed toe cap. The left boot still has a small piece of shrapnel embedded in the sole, glinting silver if the light hits it right. She doesn't remove it. She touches the boots once, just once, before closing the locker quietly and heading back to the floor. The night shift at Seattle General moves with its own rhythm, slower than day's shift, heavier somehow, as if the darkness outside has weight. Fewer visitors. Fewer families pacing the hallways. Just nurses and the dying and the machines that measure the distance between them. Sarah prefers it this way. Invisible is easier. Invisible doesn't require explanations. Down the hall from the nurse's station, wheelchair wheels squeak against linoleum as an orderly pushes an 8-year-old boy toward the pediatric ward. The child's name is Marcus. His thin arm bears a faded tattoo, crude letters spelling Angel Chen, inked in the kind of black ink that only field medics carry in their kits, the kind that doesn't fade even after years pass and continents separate and memories become unreliable narrators of their own stories. Marcus's vacant eyes don't register the night shift nurse as she steps aside to let him pass. His gaze is fixed on something far away. Something that might be nothing at all. Commander Blake follows behind his son. Exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The kind of exhaustion that isn't cured by sleep, it's the exhaustion of carrying a child through 2 miles of enemy fire. Of hearing doctors say there's nothing more that can be done. Of watching your son move from room to room in a wheelchair, waiting for someone, anyone, to help. The commander's shoulders are broad, military straight, the kind of posture that comes from 23 years of service and 3 deployments to the Gulf. But his eyes are soft. Broken. He doesn't see Sarah either as they pass. Dr. Whitfield watches this entire exchange from the physician's lounge on the 4th floor. He's standing near the window, phone already in hand, his expression calculating in the way of men who've learned to weaponize institutional authority. He's 47 years old. Drives a 2023 Mercedes. Has a country club membership that costs $60,000 to join. His father was a neurosurgeon. His grandfather was a surgeon before that. Medicine runs through his bloodline like a title deed to a small country. He watches Sarah step aside for the commander and his son, and something in his face tightens. A recognition, perhaps. Or the faint tremor of threat detected. That's the problem right there, Whitfield says to his colleague, Dr. Marcus Pierce, who's reviewing charts at the table nearby. His voice carries the kind of condescension reserved for people he considers beneath him. Night shift nurses from community college programs. That's why we're failing accreditation. No standards. No institutional knowledge. Just bodies filling shifts. Dr. Pierce looks up from his charts. He's a decent enough man, not brilliant, not terrible, just competent enough to keep his head down. She seems competent enough from what I've seen. Whitfield's jaw tightens. Competence and education aren't the same thing. Look at her charting methodology. I'm pulling examples for grand rounds tomorrow. That's exactly what we need to correct at this institution. He sets his phone down with the careful precision of someone making a calculated move. Actually, pull up her patient files. I want to make an example of her documentation issues. Live case study. What Dr. Whitfield doesn't know, what no one at Seattle General knows except the 2 federal agents embedded in administration, is that Sarah Chen's presence here isn't circumstance. It's assignment. Naval Intelligence placed her at this hospital 6 months ago to monitor a suspected medical fraud ring. The billing patterns. The inflated charges for procedures never performed. The insurance fraud that's been quietly siphoning nearly $400,000 a month from patient accounts and government programs. Whitfield's signature is on 90% of the suspicious claims. But the investigation needs more. It needs proof. It needs him to commit another act on record. Sarah enters pediatric room 407 at 2:41 a.m. to check Marcus Blake's vital signs. The room is dark except for the monitor's glow, green lines tracing across the screen like mountains on a map. The boy sleeps with the kind of deep, pharmaceutical sleep that comes from pain medication. His left arm rests on top of the blanket. She sees the tattoo immediately. Angel Chen. 2 words. 4 letters each. Inked in black that has faded to a kind of grey-blue over time. Her hands remain steady. This is the training. This is what 9 years of military service teaches you: compartmentalize and suppress the reaction. Execute the task. The past is mission context, nothing more. She checks his pulse. 68. Normal. She checks his oxygen saturation on the monitor, 97%. Good. She logs the numbers in his chart with the clinical efficiency of someone documenting a stranger's vital signs. But her eyes linger on the tattoo for exactly 3 seconds too long. Commander Blake sits in the chair beside the bed, his head tilted back against the wall, his breathing deep and regular. He hasn't slept properly in 3 weeks. His shoes are still laced. His uniform jacket is folded carefully over the second chair. In his right hand, he holds a photograph, Marcus before the spinal cord injury, standing upright, smiling at the camera, his small hand raised in a wave. Sarah checks his full line. The fluids are running at the correct rate. Everything is balanced. Everything is monitored. Everything that can be measured is being measured. But there's nothing in Seattle General's medical arsenal that can fix a severed spinal cord. Not yet. The specialists have all said no. Too risky. Too experimental. The procedure Marcus needs, the one that might give him back the ability to walk, it exists only in military hospitals and research labs. Not here. Not for an 8-year-old boy from a Coast Guard family. She finishes her documentation and moves to exit the room. That's when she notices something else. On the small table beside Marcus's bed, beneath a stack of children's books, is a military insignia. A first-class petty officer's rating badge. Faded, worn, but unmistakably official. It's been pressed to the table as if placed there for safekeeping. As if someone needed to hold on to it. Sarah's jaw tightens. Imperceptibly. Just a single muscle contraction at the hinge of her jaw. That's all she allows herself. She leaves the room and moves down the corridor toward the supply closet, a small room filled with gauze and gloves and all the small materials that keep a hospital functional. She closes the door behind her. Locks it. And allows herself one slow breath. The breath comes in through her nose. The smell of antiseptic and plastic storage bins and something else, memory, maybe. Remedy. 2009, the building burning. The boy in her arms. The medic pressing the needle to skin while bullets punch through the walls. Angel Chen. That's what the insurgents called her. Not her real name. Her call sign. The angel of death who walked through fire and didn't burn. That was a different life. That was a different woman. She exhales slowly. Brings her hands together. Looks at her palms. Steady. Professional. The hands of a nurse doing her job. She counts backward from 10. A technique they taught her at Coronado. Calming the autonomic nervous system. Bringing the heart rate down. Bringing the breathing into rhythm. By the time she exits the supply closet, she's a ghost again. Invisible. Invisible. The night shift nurse with steady hands and no history. The one who keeps her worn combat boots in her locker and says nothing about why they're there. The one who moves through the hallways of Seattle General like she belongs nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. But what happened next would change that calculation entirely. The Grand Rounds conference room at Seattle General smelled like stale coffee and the particular silence that comes before humiliation. 27 medical staff occupied the tiered seating, residents and attendings arranged like a courtroom audience, fluorescent lights humming their institutional drone above unforgiving grey walls. Sarah Chen stood at the back, hands folded, her night shift scrub still damp from a medication spill she'd cleaned it for in the morning. She hadn't expected to be here. Night shift nurses didn't attend grand rounds. They didn't exist in the daylight world of teaching hospitals and professional hierarchies. Dr. Whitfield stood at the podium with the ease of a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. His voice carried the particular timbre of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. He clicked a remote. The wall-mounted screen illuminated with a chart, Sarah's chart, magnified to grotesque proportions for public scrutiny. "Let's examine what happens," Whitfield announced, his tone carrying the weight of disappointed expectation, "when we lower our hiring standards." A red laser pointer circle appeared on a timestamp. Nurse Chen documented a medication administration at 03:14 hours using military time format. His pause was deliberate. Surgical. Without the required hospital conversion to standard civilian documentation protocol. Pediatric oncology, not boot camp. Yet somehow we continue to staff our night shift with community college graduates who apparently bring their entire backgrounds into every clinical decision. Laughter rippled through the residents, not harsh, but present. Complicit. The kind of laughter that required no courage to produce. Sarah's jaw tightened. Not visibly. The movement lived in the space between muscle fibers, in the compression of her temporalis that took for years of military discipline to control. Her hands remained at her sides. Her breathing stayed level. Her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the screen, somewhere that didn't include Dr. Whitfield's face. He clicked again. Another chart. Another timestamp variance, this one a missing decimal point that Sarah had corrected in the next entry. And here. Whitfield's finger jabbed at the screen. A dosage notation that could, in theory, be misread by anyone with basic literacy challenges. He turned to the residents. This is why we maintain standards. This is why some institutions can maintain accreditation and others. He let the sentence hang, unfinished. Devastating. Dr. Patricia Mercy, the surgical chief, exchanged a glance with her resident that Sarah caught in her peripheral vision. Mercy was decent. She looked uncomfortable. But she didn't speak. The presentation continued for 7 more minutes. Each slide was Sarah's work. Each slide was reduced to a data point in Whitfield's argument about institutional decline. By the time he finished, the message was crystalline: Sarah represented a problem. Not a person. A metric of failure. At 11:19 a.m., Sarah stood in front of the vending machine on the 3rd floor, waiting for a cup of coffee that tasted like warm plastic and resignation. She'd been a Master Chief Petty Officer. She'd led 17 personnel through a compound breach in Ramadi. She'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between extraction and body bags. And now she was standing in front of a vending machine while Dr. Whitfield spoke loudly to Dr. Pemberton 2 feet away, as if she couldn't hear him. Night shift talent pool gets shallower every year, Whitfield said. We're scraping bottom. Hiring nurses who couldn't get positions at urgent care clinics. The coffee machine hissed. The sound cut through his words, mechanical, indifferent to institutional politics. He turned to her then. His expression shifted. The condescension transformed into something approximating sympathy. This was worse than the laughter. This was the voice of a man offering you a graceful exit from a game you weren't equipped to play. No offense, Chen. But you might be more comfortable somewhere less academically rigorous. County clinic, maybe. I could put in a word. Actually, security could help you clear out your locker today if you wanted to make this transition easy. No need to drag it out. Sarah's hand closed around the coffee cup. Her knuckles turned white, exactly the kind of tell that meant she was using every ounce of discipline not to do something that would cost her the mission. 2 seconds. Then 3. Then her fingers relaxed. I'll finish my shift, doctor. Her voice came out flat. Empty. The voice of someone who'd learned that words were currency best spent only when they mattered. She took the coffee and walked past him. Pemberton smirked. She didn't acknowledge it. By 2:45 p.m., Whitfield had cornered her outside Marcus Blake's room. The boy was in a wheelchair today, his small frame barely registering against the oversized cushions. Through the window, Sarah could see him watching rain streak the glass. That faded tattoo on his arm. Angel Chen. The name insurgents had given her in Ramadi. The name that meant something to a child who couldn't remember why. That Blake kid. Whitfield's voice was low, conspiratorial. Lost cause. Every specialist in 3 states has refused the experimental spinal procedure. 60% mortality rate. Career suicide. He paused, letting the implication settle. You're wasting time on false hope. Focus on patients who might actually improve our outcomes metrics. Unless you're too emotionally attached to failure cases to think clearly. Sarah looked at him directly for the first time all day. Her eyes were the color of a storm front that hadn't decided whether to produce rain or lightning. When she spoke, each word came out with the precision of a weapon being placed on a table. I'll do my job, doctor. She didn't wait for a response. She entered Marcus's room and closed the door with controlled precision, not a slam, but firm enough that the latch clicked with finality. Inside, the room was warm. A humidifier misted the air. Rain hammered the window like urgent hands asking for entry. Marcus didn't turn from the glass. Sarah stood for exactly 3 seconds with her eyes closed. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the kind of restraint that comes from having survived worse. One slow breath. Then another. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was the mechanism that kept her from doing the things she'd been trained to do. She moved to the bedside. How's the pain today? It's okay. Marcus's voice was small, the sound of a child who'd learned not to complain. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you always seem sad when you look at me? Sarah's hand stilled. Pain was information. This pain was the information that came from carrying someone through fire and having them not recognize you. From being close enough to touch the scar tissue of a child's forgotten trauma while pretending to be a stranger offering bandages. I just want you to get better, she said finally. She settled into the chair beside his wheelchair and stayed there for the rest of her shift, watching rain, thinking about the tattoo on his arm, understanding with crystalline clarity that everything was about to become impossible. But that wasn't the worst part. At 3:20 a.m., when the hospital was nothing but whispers and machines and the kind of darkness that comes from fluorescent lights fighting insomnia, Sarah sat at a terminal in the empty radiology reading room. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the ease of someone for whom cybersecurity was a language learned before her first deployment. The hospital firewall was adequate for keeping out casual intruders. It wasn't designed for someone trained by naval intelligence. The billing database opened. She scrolled. Whitfield's insurance claims bloomed across the screen like a confession written in code. Inflated billing codes for procedures never performed. Ghost surgeries. A patient billed for emergency heart reconstruction who'd only received a consultation. Another charged for spinal fusion who'd been treated with physical therapy. A systematic fraud network spanning 18 months. She estimated the theft at $840,000. She photographed each screen with her employee badge camera, a device that looked like it held her ID but contained a micro lens that fed directly to a secure cloud. Her handler would see these images by morning. The investigation timeline was tight. 6 weeks to coordinate with FBI Financial Crimes Division. 6 weeks to document Whitfield's entire operation before her cover collapsed. Then Marcus's case file crossed her screen at 4:15 a.m. The deteriorating spinal condition matched what she'd seen in Ramadi. Progressive paralysis. Vertebral compression from trauma. The kind of injury that turned soldiers into patients and patients into statistics. Every specialist in Philadelphia had refused the experimental decompression procedure because the mortality rate was unforgivable and no surgeon wanted that failure on their record. But Sarah had performed open cardiac massage through a left anterior lateral thoracotomy on soldiers in worse condition. She'd kept people alive using nothing but her hands and discipline and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She pulled up his intake photographs from 3 years ago. The emergency admission images. There. The tattoo. Visible even in the chaos of trauma documentation. Angel Chen. Her own name. Inked by medic first class David Holloway in a Phi base outside Ramadi. Tattooed onto the arm of a dying child she'd carried through 2 miles of enemy fire after an IED turned a building into fire and metal and the particular silence of impossible situations. The traumatic brain injury had stolen his memory. He didn't know her. Commander Blake didn't know her. She'd been treating the boy she saved for 3 weeks without breaking cover. Without flinching. Without allowing herself the luxury of being anything but what the mission required. The coffee had long gone cold. Sarah stared at the screen, watching Marcus's face, older now, changed by pain and time and the weight of forgetting, and understood with total clarity that everything she'd built was about to collapse. At 5:40 a.m., she watched Whitfield arrive through the hospital security camera she'd accessed with the same ease she'd accessed the billing records. He moved through the hallways with the confidence of a man who'd never considered the possibility of consequence. His private office door closed. Within minutes, she heard his voice through the unsecured phone line she'd tapped to monitor his communications. 3 board members, he said to his first contact. Yes, I know they owe me. Tell them there's a problematic staff member we need to address. Night shift nurse. Yes, that one. We need documentation of inadequate charting practices for the file. A pause. Then, liability concerns. I'm going to recommend immediate termination, and I need institutional support before she escalates into a wrongful termination lawsuit. Sarah sat in the dark radiology reading room and understood that her mission and Marcus Blake's survival were now on a collision course that neither one of them could control. The monitor screamed at 1:35 in the morning. Sarah was halfway through administering Marcus's routine medication, a standard antibiotic drip for the infection that had settled in his lungs 3 days ago, when the cardiac monitor began its high-pitched wail. His blood pressure spiked from a stable 98/62 to 144/90 in the space of 4 seconds. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, steady and calm, indifferent to the crisis unfolding around it. She didn't look up. Not yet. The clinical part of her brain was already calculating. High BP spike plus deteriorating spine plus compromised motor function below the L for vertebra meant one thing: the structural collapse she'd been monitoring in his imaging for 72 hours had accelerated catastrophically. His spine wasn't just degenerating anymore. It was actively compressing the spinal cord, pinching the neural pathways that controlled everything below his waist, and doing it in real time. The resident, a young man named Chen, no relation, terrified eyes, fumbled for the call button. Code, we need a code. Stop. Sarah's voice came out flat. Not harsh. Just factual. She was already moving, her hand moving to the call system with the kind of calm that only comes when you've stood in rooms where people were actively dying. Get me the surgical kit. The one marked for emergency spinal access. Top shelf of the locked cabinet. Code is 0724. That's for now. The resident ran. Sarah pulled on fresh gloves, her movements economical, no wasted energy. The monitors continued their screaming symphony. 147/92. 151/94. Marcus's small body was going into a compensatory crisis, his heart rate climbing to 138 beats per minute as his autonomic nervous system realized the spinal cord was being crushed like a cable in a closing fist. He was still sedated, thank Christ, or the pain would have made him thrash himself to permanent paralysis. The window was closing. She had 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if she was lucky, before the compression became complete, before the neural damage became irreversible, before Marcus Blake spent the rest of his life not just in a wheelchair but completely paralyzed below the neck. A prisoner in his own body. The same body that bore her call sign tattooed on a 7-year-old's arm in a medic's tent in Ramadi while the boy screamed from shrapnel wounds and she sang to him in Mandarin to keep him conscious. She couldn't let that happen twice. The resident returned with the surgical kit, sterile, unopened, the kind meant for field decompression or emergency neurosurgical intervention. His hands were shaking. Dr. Whitfield is on his way. ETA 8 minutes from the parking garage. 8 minutes was forever when your spinal cord was being severed in real time. Sarah prepped the injection site with betadine, her movements precise as a sniper preparing to fire. The antiseptic smell, sharp, iodine-laced, cut through the sterile hospital air. She could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the ventilator's steady mechanical breath, the monitors beeping their urgent rhythm. 156/98. The pressure was building like a hydraulic system with a failing valve. Call the attending neurosurgeon. Tell him it's a medical emergency at code 0. Tell him it's Marcus Blake. She was preparing the needle now, a 14-gauge angiocath, positioning it at the exact angle and depth required for safe access to the compressed vertebrae. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers, muscle memory overriding every conscious thought. 7 years of peacetime nursing dissolved. 7 years of pretending to be just another night shift RN at Seattle General evaporated. What remained was pure combat medicine, the kind of field craft she'd learned in a trauma tent that had more incoming fire than sterile equipment. The resident was making calls, his voice cracking. We need neuro. Now. 1:35 a.m. Pediatric spinal compression. Yes, it's an emergency. Sarah administered local anesthetic with the same controlled precision, then positioned the needle. This was the moment that separated competent from dangerous, skilled from lethal. 1 centimeter too far in any direction and she'd sever the spinal cord entirely. 1 centimeter too shallow and she'd miss the compression point. The pressure had to be relieved from inside the spinal canal, manually, using a decompression technique that belonged in an operating room with a full surgical team, not in a pediatric ICU room at 1:37 in the morning. She didn't think about that. Thinking was for people with options. The needle penetrated the ligamentum flavum with a tactile click, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to hands that had done this before. She could feel the change in resistance, the subtle shift that meant she'd breached the epidural space. Through the needle, she guided a small surgical spreader, a titanium instrument no larger than a paperclip, designed to gently separate tissue and relieve pressure on compressed neural structures. Her movements were economical, mechanical, the movements of someone operating on pure training and pure instinct. The monitor's screaming began to level out. 152/90. 148/88. O2 saturation holding at 94%. Marcus's heart rate plateaued at 135. The autonomic panic was subsiding because the immediate threat was being relieved. His body recognized that someone, something, had stopped trying to kill him. She didn't stop. She worked the spreader through controlled micro-adjustments, relieving the pressure on the compressed nerve roots, feeling the tissue begin to decompress beneath her hands like a release valve finally opening. 142/85. 138. 132. The numbers were moving in the right direction. Time was collapsing toward her deadline. 75 seconds had passed. Maybe 80. The closure required 3 sutures, with absorbable material and a technique that would prevent infection while allowing the surgical site to heal without scar tissue. Her fingers flew through the movements. Thread through tissue. Small knot. Advance. Repeat. The sutures were tiny, designed for pediatric anatomy, and her hands had the kind of control that only comes from thousands of repetitions. Combat surgeries intense. Training scenarios at Camp Lejeune. Field medicine courses that no nurse was supposed to have taken. 141/82. 70 sutures. The worst of the pressure was relieved. At 1:38 exactly, she was applying the final dressing when the door burst open like a grenade had detonated against it. Dr. Whitfield filled the doorway, his face a mask of controlled rage that immediately fractured into something like disbelief. He was still wearing his street clothes, a $2,000 suit, the kind that screamed old money and inherited superiority, and his eyes moved from Marcus to the monitors to Sarah's hands, and then back again, trying to process what he was seeing. Sarah was still wearing her scrubs. Still gloved. Still moving with the kind of calm efficiency that only comes when the crisis is already past. "What the hell did you just do?" His voice wasn't a question. It was a demand, the tone of a man whose authority had just been publicly and irreparably challenged. Emergency spinal decompression. Sarah stripped off her gloves without looking at him. Her voice was level, conversational, the tone you'd use to describe the weather. He was in complete spinal cord compression. Neural damage would have been irreversible within 90 seconds. He's stable now. Around them, the residents had frozen. The night shift respiratory tech stood motionless beside the ventilator. Every eye in the room had moved to Whitfield, watching his face, waiting for the explosion. "You're a nurse," he said quietly. Dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. A night shift nurse from community college. "You just performed emergency neurosurgery." "I performed an emergency decompression." His spinal cord is intact. His vital signs are stable. His prognosis went from permanent paralysis to possible recovery in the next 90 seconds. Sarah was already moving to the medication dispenser, checking Marcus's post-emergency medications with the kind of focus that suggested Whitfield had already ceased to exist in her mind. The neurosurgeon is 7 minutes away. He'll be able to assess whether surgery is still indicated or whether we averted the crisis. Whitfield's face went white first. Then crimson. The color climbed from his neck to his jawline to his forehead like a thermometer rising in heat. His hands clenched at his sides. "You just ended your career," he said, and every word came out with the precision of an executioner reading a death sentence. "I'm calling the board. I'm calling the nursing commission. I'm calling the state medical board. You performed a procedure you're not licensed to perform on a patient I was overseeing. That's criminal negligence. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's saving his life," the resident interrupted quietly. Around him, the other residents were exchanging looks, the kind of looks people exchange when they've just watched the rules of the world shift fundamentally. His monitors flatlined for 3 seconds in the minute before she started. His O2 dropped to 48. He was coding. She stopped the code without a crash cart. Whitfield didn't even glance at the resident. His eyes were locked on Sarah, and in them was something like fear. Not fear of her. Fear of what she represented. A force in his hospital that operated outside his authority. A nurse whose hands had just done something his entire medical education said was impossible. "Get her out of here," he said, and his voice had lost its rage, had instead taken on the flat, deadly quality of an order that expected immediate obedience. "Call security. I want her escorted out of this hospital within the next 10 minutes. I don't care if we're in the middle of active patient care. Out. Now." Sarah continued checking Marcus's vital signs. She was documenting something in the monitor system, medication times, vital sign trends, the exact timeline of events. Leaving a paper trail. Protecting the boy. His neurological status needs to be monitored every 15 minutes for the next 4 hours, she said, speaking to the resident as if Whitfield had already left the room. If you see any deterioration in motor response, any change in his pupils, any fluctuation in blood pressure above 140 or below 80, call neuro immediately. He's not out of danger yet. I said out, Whitfield repeated. His voice was shaking now. Barely controlled. The tone of a man realizing that his authority, the invisible force field that protected him in this hospital, had just developed a crack. Sarah turned to face him. For the first time, their eyes met directly. She was still wearing her scrubs, still wearing the small identification badge that identified her as a night shift RN, still looking exactly like what she was supposed to be, a competent hospital employee. Nothing in her expression suggested she'd just performed neurosurgery at 1:38 in the morning. Nothing in her posture suggested fear of his threats. Someone will be here in 90 seconds, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a request anymore. It was information. He's stabilized. He'll be evaluated by neurosurgery when they arrive. The rest is on you. She pulled off her other glove and stepped away from the monitoring equipment, moving with the kind of calm that suggested she'd already won something neither of them had words for yet. Outside Marcus's room, Sarah could hear footsteps on the tile. Security, probably. Or maybe Whitfield's people, coming to escort her out of the hospital that had been her cover for 7 years, her mission ground, her only connection to the boy who bore her military call sign tattooed on his wrist. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She simply turned and walked toward the doors, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her mind already 3 steps ahead of whatever was about to happen next. Behind her, she could hear Whitfield's voice rising again, hear the resident explaining what had just occurred, hear the monitors continuing their steady electronic heartbeat above it all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her career as a nurse, her cover, her mission, her 7-year anchor to this hospital and this boy, had just been revealed in a single 90-second crisis. And she had no idea what happened now. 40 minutes after Sarah's hand stabilized Marcus Blake's spinal cord, Dr. Whitfield moved through the hospital with the precision of a man who'd learned to weaponize institutional power. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as he pulled his phone from his coat pocket at 2:15 in the morning, a timestamp he would later regret, one that would appear in discovery logs and federal investigations, and dialed the first number. Board member. Cardiologist. A man who'd billed insurance for $1,700 procedures that never happened, who knew that Sarah's investigation into the database could trace every transaction back through the network. Whitfield's voice stayed calm. Conversational. We have a credential crisis. A night shift nurse performed an authorized neurosurgery. The state board needs to move fast. The cardiologist understood immediately. A credential investigation would bury Sarah's ability to testify. A fired nurse had no credibility. A nurse under investigation for fraud had none at all. The second call came at 2:22. Another board member. An orthopedic surgeon who'd padded his billing records with ghost consultations. Another man who understood that Sarah was a threat to the careful architecture of fraud that Whitfield had constructed, brick by brick, over 7 years. I'm documenting everything, Whitfield said. She's dangerous. We need this moving by morning. The third call went to a physician assistant program director, a man Whitfield had used before, a consultant on retainer for exactly these situations, someone who could be reached at any hour and who understood the value of professional cooperation. I need an expedited credential review, Whitfield said. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Possible falsified qualifications. I'm attaching my incident report. Each sentence was calculated. Each word chosen for maximum legal insulation. By 2:45, Whitfield had contacted the state nursing board with a formal complaint citing unauthorized practice of medicine and patient endangerment despite positive outcome. The complaint was crafted with lawyerly precision. It didn't deny that Marcus Blake had survived. It didn't dispute the medical necessity. It simply stated a fact that was also a trap: a nurse had performed surgery. That alone was the crime, regardless of the result, regardless of the child's life, regardless of the desperation that had forced the choice. Hospital legal arrived at 3:30 in the morning, moving through the pre-dawn hallways like sharks following blood in dark water. The interim nursing director, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Seattle General for 18 years and had personally fought for better night shift staffing, appeared in the break room with the exhausted look of someone who'd been pulled from sleep and fed a prepared script. "Sarah, I need your badge." Not a request. Not even really a question. The words of someone following instructions, someone caught between compassion and institutional self-preservation. Commander Blake stood in the hallway outside Marcus's ICU room, his son sleeping in the wheelchair beside him, the boy's small frame looking even smaller against the medical equipment surrounding him. Blake's voice cracked. "She saved my son's life. Every doctor in this city refused to help him. She made the choice that no one else would make." The hospital's legal counsel, a man whose business card cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, didn't look away from his tablet. "Which is precisely why this constitutes practicing medicine without a license, Commander. Regardless of outcome. The law is quite clear on this matter." The interim director's hands shook as she spoke. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm truly sorry." Sarah removed her identification badge without expression, her hands perfectly steady, and placed it on the counter between them. The badge photo showed a younger version of her, hair pulled back, the kind of neutral expression that people learned when they'd been trained to disappear. She'd learned that expression in Ramadi, refined it in a dozen black sites across 4 continents, and perfected it in the hallways of Seattle General over 7 years of carefully maintained invisibility. The security guard who escorted her to the staff lockers was the same man who'd smirked during the vending machine incident, the one who'd heard Whitfield's comments about community college nurses and hospital accreditation. His eyes didn't meet hers now. Something in him recognized what he was witnessing, some vestigial instinct that knew he was escorting someone dangerous out of the building, though his conscious mind couldn't quite process why. He walked 3 feet behind her, the kind of distance people maintained with things they feared without understanding why. Sarah's locker stood open, displaying 7 years of accumulated life. 2 pairs of scrubs. A small bottle of hand sanitizer. A photo of the Philadelphia skyline, taken from the apartment roof. And at the bottom, the pair of worn combat boots, size too large to be hers, issued in 2007 at Camp Lejeune before her first deployment, breaking in on the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Shank in Loga Province, scuffed and salt-stained from 2 decades of running toward danger instead of away from it. She picked up the boots and held them for 3 seconds, the leather creasing in her hands like they remembered every mile, every crisis, every moment of her life before Philadelphia. Before the cover. Before the Navy assigned her to a hospital to investigate billing fraud that had somehow intersected with the only living remnant of her own past, a boy with a faded tattoo on his arm and no memory of the woman who'd carried him through burning streets. Sarah placed the boots in her personal bag and closed the locker door with a click that sounded like a coffin ceiling. The walk through the emergency department took 90 seconds. Every staff member watched. The nurses she'd trained. The residents she'd mentored. The patients she'd stayed late to comfort when the day's shift was busy. The people who'd known her only as the competent night shift nurse who never complained, never explained, never showed anything but the mask. They parted for her like a crowd sensing a predator, though none of them understood what they were sensing. This was the only reaction that came close to the truth, not fear, exactly, but the recognition that someone dangerous was moving among them, and they were only now beginning to understand that the danger had never been the threat. The exterior doors opened to Philadelphia's cold gray dawn, the air carrying the smell of wet concrete and distant diesel exhaust from trucks beginning their early routes. Sarah didn't hesitate. She walked out without looking back, her phone vibrating in her pocket before she'd reached the parking lot. Naval Intelligence Handler. The message was terse, "Your access just went dark." "Explain." She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. 6 months of investigation, the billing patterns traced, the network documented, the conspiracy mapped across 17 physicians and for administrators who'd been systematically defrauding insurance companies of approximately $2.3 million per year. Enough evidence to trigger a full FBI audit. Enough documentation to end careers. Enough to save the hospital and protect the thousands of future patients who would have been victimized by continued fraud. All of it gone. Her cover blown. Her access revoked. Her career terminated. And Marcus Blake alive, though the cost was her 7-year mission collapsing like a building in free fall. The all-night diner sat 6 blocks from Seattle General, a place called Rose's where the coffee tasted like it had been brewed during the Reagan administration and the pie never went stale because nobody actually ate it, they just looked at it while staring out the window at their own failures. Sarah ordered coffee at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the waitress, a woman with 60 years of night shift written into the lines of her face, didn't ask questions. She just poured the cup and left the pot. Sarah sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seating, her reflection staring back at her from the dark window, coffee gone cold in front of her within 20 minutes because she wasn't drinking it, she was just holding it while watching the woman in the glass who looked like a stranger. The woman who'd been trained to compartmentalize, to survive, to adapt to any identity and then shed it like skin when the mission was complete. The woman who'd learned that personal investment was a weakness that could destroy operations. The woman who was now looking at the reflection of someone who'd made a choice that wasn't about the mission at all. The boots were in her bag under the table. The combat boots that had carried her through Ramadi and Mosul and Kandahar and 100 unnamed locations where she'd learned that saving lives and destroying careers were sometimes the same choice, sometimes the only choice, sometimes the choice you made even knowing it would cost everything you'd built. The coffee stayed cold. The reflection never blinked. And somewhere in the building 6 blocks away, Marcus Blake slept in an ICU bed, alive because a woman in worn combat boots had remembered that some codes ran deeper than missions, some oaths transcended cover stories, and some debts could only be paid by burning everything else down. The silence in the diner was so thick you could hear the rain outside, the Philadelphia dawn gathering behind dark clouds, the weight of consequences settling down like an anchor that would hold her to the bottom until everything else, career, mission, identity, the careful architecture of invisibility, stopped mattering at all. The ER doors slid open at 11:11 a.m. on a Thursday, 2 days after Sarah's badge had been confiscated, and the man on the stretcher froze when he saw her face. His eyes went wide. Recognition flickered across his features like a match striking in darkness. He was thin now, older than she remembered, his left arm bearing scars that hadn't been there in Ramadi, but the moment his gaze locked with hers, his lips moved silently and formed 3 Mandarin syllables that turned her blood to ice water. Bazar Chensha. Bomb Angel. That was the code name insurgents had whispered in compounds and safe houses across the Jolan district. That was what they called the woman who walked into burning buildings and carried out people the Americans had already written off as dead. The man on the stretcher wasn't supposed to be in Philadelphia. He wasn't supposed to be alive. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been in an interrogation tent at FOB Shank, 3 days before the IED that killed 4 Marines and left her carrying a boy with a shattered spine out of a collapsed building while the sky burned orange. Sarah didn't move. Didn't blink. Her hands remained steady as she scanned the intake paperwork, construction accident, crushed pelvis, query for spinal fracture, while the former insurgent tried to sit up on the stretcher, his mouth working soundlessly, his eyes never leaving her face. A nurse she didn't recognize was already prepping him for imaging, but Sarah could feel the weight of his stare like pressure against her chest, like the moment before an ambush, like every instinct she'd spent 12 years training was suddenly screaming that the past had arrived in triage and nobody in this hospital understood what was standing in front of them. Master Chief Petty Officer Chen. The voice came from her left, clipped and certain. The security guard, the one who'd escorted her from the building 48 hours ago, was standing near the trauma bay entrance, his expression transformed from neutral authority to something else entirely. Recognition. Respect. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid, and when his eyes met hers they held the weight of someone who'd served in the same wars, under the same sky, with the same understanding of what it meant to walk out alive when others didn't. I served under your command. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. You have 3 Navy Crosses. He said it quietly, to the 2 nurses within earshot and the 1 resident beginning to pull up imaging protocols. 3. Sir. The word came out with something that sounded like forgiveness. The trauma bay fell silent. The heart monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm. The ventilator wheezed at a nearby bed. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for this exact moment to collapse under its own weight, a Coast Guard general in dress blue stepped through the emergency department doors, here to visit his nephew. The chart would later show a routine family visit that would rewrite everything, and his eyes caught the commotion, caught the security guard's stance, caught Sarah's face, and his hand moved instinctively to the phone in his pocket. He scrolled. His expression shifted from casual interest to disbelief to something approaching awe. He read her personnel file on the screen, the redacted portions, the unredacted commendations, the security clearances that had been hidden under layers of administrative silence for 18 months, and when he looked up again, he was looking at her the way you look at photographs in history books. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Blake. He announced it like a proclamation, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. Your son is in ICU bed 7. You carried him 2 miles through enemy fire. He was looking past Sarah now, at the man on the stretcher, at the former insurgent whose eyes had gone wet. Master Chief Chen. You have a Bronze Star. He paused. Each medal was its own sentence, its own moment. Silver Star. His voice grew quieter but somehow louder, the kind of quiet that fills every space. 2 Purple Hearts. He looked at the gathered staff, the nurses, the residents, the security guards, the administrative coordinator, and when he spoke again, it was to all of them. And a Navy Cross. The doors to ICU opened at 11:59 a.m., and Commander Blake stepped through them with his jaw clenched tight and his shoulders moving like a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally found somewhere to put it down. His eyes found Sarah's face and something broke in him right there in the trauma bay. Tears streamed down his face without a sound, without apology, the kind of tears that come when you're standing next to someone who'd saved your child's life twice, once in a burning building in a country 8,000 miles away, and once again in the darkness of a hospital corridor when she'd put her hands on your son's chest and refused to let him die. He wasn't speaking. He was breathing like he'd been underwater and had just broken the surface. He reached for the hem of Marcus's hospital gown, the one they'd brought from ICU, and pulled it up to reveal the faded tattoo, Angel Chen, inked in medical-grade black by a combat medic with a needle and steady hands, and the knowledge that the boy in his arms might not survive the next hour, might not survive the next day, so better to leave something permanent, something that said I was here, I was saved, I was loved by someone willing to walk through fire. She carried him. Commander Blake's voice cracked like old concrete. 2 miles. Enemy fire. Everyone else said Marcus was dead weight. She carried him anyway. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of hospitals, not the mechanical white noise of monitors and ventilators and fluorescent lights humming overhead. This was the silence that comes when the world realizes it has been fundamentally wrong about someone. It lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then FBI Special Agent Victoria Torres walked through the emergency department doors with 4 agents and a warrant that had been signed at 9:15 a.m. that morning, and everything Sarah had burned down to protect, her cover, her mission, her 7 years of invisibility, suddenly became the only thing that mattered. Dr. Whitfield. Torres's voice was professional, clipped, the kind of calm that comes from holding certainty like a weapon. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, evidence tampering, and obstruction of a federal investigation. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The agents moved past the assembled medical staff with the smooth precision of people who'd done this before, people who understood the weight of justice as a physical force. We've recovered your attempts to forge disciplinary records in the hospital database this morning at 9:11 a.m. 18 months of billing irregularities. Ghost procedures. Inflated coding. Insurance kickbacks totaling $2.3 million. All of it documented. All of it time-stamped. Torres spread photographs across the nearest counter, printouts of computer screens, transaction records, forensic analysis of system access logs. Each one was another nail. Each one was another reason the hospital board members he'd called for favors were now leaning away from him as if proximity to his catastrophe might be contagious. You attempted to destroy evidence of federal crimes by fabricating your employees' records. That's a felony. The handcuffs clicked at 2:42 p.m. The same security guards who'd walked Sarah out of the building 48 hours earlier, the ones who had no choice, who were following orders from a surgeon with enough institutional power to make their jobs complicated if they refused, now walked Dr. Whitfield through the emergency department while phones captured video from 24 angles. His lawyer arrived at 3:15 p.m. with talking points that crumbled the moment Torres produced the digital evidence. By 5:19 p.m., the medical board had suspended his license pending criminal trial. By 6:13 p.m., his partnership in surgical practice had been dissolved via conference call. His reputation, built over 20 years with careful cultivation and strategic favoritism and the kind of arrogance that comes from never being held accountable, collapsed in under 4 hours like a building with insufficient foundation. 2 years later, Commander Blake sent Sarah an email with 2 attached photographs. In the first, Dr. Whitfield sat at a folding table in a strip mall parking lot, the kind of parking lot that's all cracked asphalt and empty dreams, selling supplemental insurance policies to shoppers who walked past without stopping. His medical career was gone. His license was permanently revoked. His federal conviction had required $4.2 million in restitution. He was 53 years old and he was selling insurance from a folding table on a Tuesday afternoon. In the second photograph, Marcus Blake, now 10 years old, his memory of Ramadi still absent but his understanding of the story now complete, stood with his left hand on a crutch and his right hand on a combat boot, the size too large to be his, the leather creased from deployment cycles and field operations and the weight of someone else's sacrifice. A specialist, freed from liability concerns after Sarah's military credentials confirmed the emergency decompression had been not only sound but brilliant, had completed the full spinal reconstruction 6 weeks after the FBI warrant. Marcus's recovery was 40% functional mobility, enough to walk with braces, enough to live outside a wheelchair, enough to have a future that extended beyond the borders of the one Dr. Whitfield had condemned him to. Sarah still worked the night shift at Seattle General by choice. She'd been reinstated, promoted, elevated to both nurse and ongoing intelligence consultant for the FBI's healthcare fraud task force. The task force had expanded from the original investigation into 3 states, 12 hospitals, a network of providers caught in billing schemes that would never have surfaced without her initial undercover work. She moved through the corridors with the same quiet precision she'd always possessed, still mostly invisible to the staff, her hands steady and sure as she performed patient care that had nothing to do with combat medicine and everything to do with the kind of quiet strength that comes from having survived worse. Commander Blake brought Marcus to visit on the first Thursday of every month. The boy didn't remember the woman who'd carried him through burning buildings. His memory of Ramadi had been stolen by traumatic brain injury. The past was a locked door his mind refused to open. But he knew the story now. He knew what the tattoo meant. He knew that Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had walked into fire twice, once with a rifle and once with a stethoscope, and that some kinds of heroism don't wear medals where people can see them. In the break room at 3:41 a.m., Sarah sat alone with coffee going cold in her hands, her reflection in the dark window of the break room showing not a failed mission but a completed one. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Subscribe to Code Whisperers for more stories of hidden strength and quiet heroism. Like if you believe the most dangerous people are the ones nobody's watching. Comment with your own story of someone you underestimated. And hit that notification bell. We have more heroes to expose, more cover stories to burn down, more missions worth destroying everything for.